And we had a frightful meeting with Winston, which lasted till 2 a.m. He was very tired and had tried to recuperate with drink. As a result, he was in a maudlin, bad-tempered, drunken mood.
July 1944, a vital turning point of the Second World War. As the Allied troops attempted to take Europe from the Nazis, the outcome of the war hung in the balance. But Winston Churchill, the man who led Britain's fight against Hitler, was also waging a war against mental and physical enemies of his own.
Advance, Britannia. Long live the cause of freedom. God save the King.
Winston Churchill is the best-loved Prime Minister in 20th century British history. He will always be remembered as the heroic leader who, in Britain's darkest hour, refused to quit and inspired his people to fight on to victory against Hitler. Churchill's achievements are legendary. But now, Altered Statesmen will reveal that Churchill's public image of strength concealed a man challenged by mental and physical illness and fueled by alcohol. The problems that Winston Churchill faced during the war were present from the very beginning of his public life. Winston Churchill was first elected as the Conservative MP for Oldham on the 1st of October 1900, aged just 25. He was a rising star of the political scene. But this hugely talented and successful high achiever had a secret. He was sometimes gripped by dark moods of introspection and periods of melancholy he couldn't shake off.
He had multiple problems. Certainly, one of them that haunted him throughout his life was a tendency to recurrent depressions, what he called his black dog.
It dogged him every step along the way, both as a child up through his entire political career.
Churchill's black dog of depression was not constant. At times, his depressive lows were followed by intense, energetic highs that gave him the charisma and drive that characterized his leadership. But some experts believe these mood changes were more than just ups and downs, but instead resemble a cyclical mood disorder that psychiatrists call cyclothymia.
Cyclothymia is a condition where the mood varies. There are ups and downs. We're all subject to daily fluctuations in our moods. And when you have cyclothymia, you fluctuate rather more than the norm, but short of what would be a frank manic depressive illness.
Clearly you see a cyclothymic personality type in Churchill. The phases of accelerated interest, activity, creative activity, that was part of his temperament, that was part of him, that was part of his personality, alternating with the lows or the black dog of depression.
Churchill's cyclothymic ups at times released great creative energy. But some historians suggest that there were times when Churchill's energetic mood could have less positive consequences. On the 4th of August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany. Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, the man in charge of the British Navy. And while other politicians greeted the start of the war with dismay, Churchill's mood was oddly different.
It's very interesting when the war breaks out. Churchill's reaction is recorded by something he said to his wife when he commented about how excited he was, and then in a rare moment of introspection said, "Is it not strange to be so constituted?" And to the rest of us, the answer to that question has to be yes, it was very strange.
At the start of the First World War, Churchill was in an excited state. But from the first weeks of the conflict, all military activity got bogged down in the trenches of Belgium and France. Churchill wanted action, so he began to champion a controversial plan for a huge naval attack on the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles was a narrow fortified shipping lane that protected Constantinople, the capital city of Germany's allies, the Ottoman Empire, now modern-day Turkey.
The whole conception of attacking Turkey through the Dardanelles was Churchill's idea. Churchill wrote the initial paper, he rode it through the cabinet, he insisted at every twist and turn in the debate that it was going to work. It was a totally bonkers idea.
Churchill threw all his energy into making sure the Dardanelles assault happened. Even though his colleague, Admiral Fisher, was so opposed to the plan, he resigned from the Admiralty.
Certainly his energy, his hyperactiveness was something that helped to push it through, helped to get it started.
Churchill's eloquence helped him win the argument in favor of the attack. But if the energy with which he pushed it through was the product of a cyclothymic up, then there were potential risks.
The problem with cyclothymic upswings is that people become irritable, become aggressive, become impatient with people who don't work as quickly as they do. They might become slightly reckless, optimistic, jump to conclusions. It can get people into trouble.
Churchill got what he wanted, and on February the 19th, 1915, the attack was launched. 6 months into the First World War, Winston Churchill was in a highly animated mood. He swept aside the doubts that veteran naval strategists, Admirals Fisher, Richmond, and Wilson had about his controversial plan to attack the Dardanelles.
It was insufficiently coordinated and insufficiently manned. It was an operation asking to fail.
When the British and the French navies do indeed force their way through the Dardanelles, but turn back because of losses. And a lot of ships are damaged, and a few thousand men die as a result of it.
But now the campaign was underway. No one in the war cabinet was willing to accept a defeat or retreat. As a result, thousands of servicemen from Australia and New Zealand were landed on the beaches of Gallipoli to back up the naval attack. The attack was badly coordinated. The assault cost 46,000 lives and 250,000 casualties.
The whole thing is an absolute military disaster. The Australians, for one, of course, have certainly never forgiven Churchill, and I don't think they've actually forgiven the British for the whole campaign. And it had a very bad effect on British morale, Commonwealth morale, and it contributed absolutely nothing to the winning of the war.
Although the landing wasn't his decision, Churchill took the blame for the disaster at Gallipoli. He was ousted from the Admiralty, a blow that was to hit him very hard.
Public defeat and humiliation can, in someone who is vulnerable, swing them into quite a severe depression.
The black dog comes upon him in the aftermath of the Dardanelles, when all his toys are taken away from him, all his activity is taken away from him, and he's got nothing to do, severely depressed.
Forced into semi-retirement, aged just 42, Churchill entered a deep depression. But he found a way to use his creativity to fight back.
He took up painting first in 1916, and the question of the Dardanelles was very large, and it was, in some sense, a distraction. He said he felt like some deep-sea fish had been drawn up from the depths, and it was floundering about on the surface with nothing better to do. Then painting came to the rescue.
Psychologists believe they know where the key to both Churchill's depression and his creative drive can be found.
Both his tendency to depression and the psychological predisposition to charismatic leadership both can be traced to earliest years.
His mother and father were two of the most brilliant political and social figures of the age, Lord Randolph and Lady Randolph Churchill.
Lord Randolph Churchill was a high-flying conservative politician who rapidly rose to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, aged just 37. But he had very little time for the young Winston.
Randolph made it clear very early on that he regarded young Winston as a bit of a dunce. And there's no doubt at all from his own descriptions that young Winston worshipped his father. He describes in his father's biography how the young Churchill was deprived of the chance of going into the Commons with his father because he was struck down early by a mystery illness. So all the way through, one gets this impression that a lot of this is about trying to impress a very distant and a very uninterested father.
For the young Winston, trying to impress this distant political father meant trying to win political fame. But the legacy of another famous family member also exerted a strong influence on Churchill. His ancestor was the legendary 18th century military hero, the Duke of Marlborough.
He was enormously proud to be the heir and descendant of John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough.
It was very important for Churchill to feel that he could live up to the military understanding, the military glory, the military might of the Churchill family. Winston Marlborough, if you like. He grew up playing with toy soldiers, and I think those toy soldiers had a personal, almost dynastic meaning for him, in a way that far exceeded the meaning that most small boys attach to their toy soldiers.
Perhaps he reasoned, if I can bring myself to the very height, perhaps at last I will have the love and rewards that I truly wish.
But those who've analyzed Churchill's early life suggest that he didn't only aspire to glory, he became convinced that he was actually destined to be a great heroic leader. Beyond the normal ambition of a talented politician, this exaggerated self-belief is a characteristic that psychologists refer to as narcissism.
I believe there's profound evidence of narcissism and egocentricity and a quest for glory, a quest for adulation. For this man with dreams of glory, nothing would do in terms of his mental well-being other than to achieve those dreams.
During the 1930s, Churchill's dreams of glory lay as yet unfulfilled. He was out of office, but he still orchestrated a series of political campaigns in which he tried to convince Parliament that he was destined to lead Britain through crisis.
The career in the wilderness in the 30s was one really of Churchill trying to be the man of destiny almost every other month. First of all, he described Gandhi as a half-naked fakir of a type well known in the East who was a danger to the whole empire. After that, of course, he allied himself in the abdication crisis with Edward VIII, leader of the King's Party, again prophesying doom and gloom.
And so, when Churchill at last made a prophecy of doom that was really true, he didn't get the audience he deserved. In 1933, Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany, intent on rearming and expanding into neighboring countries. Churchill alone bravely spoke out against Hitler, insisting that he would need to be stopped by force. But Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain chose to try to negotiate with Hitler, a policy called appeasement.
Everyone had heard Churchill pronounce that doom was around the corner. It's one reason that his anti-appeasement, anti-Hitler stance wasn't taken as seriously as it ought to have been. Quite simply, they'd heard it all before.
But Churchill was right. As Hitler first annexed Austria in 1938 and sent his tanks into Czechoslovakia and Poland in 1939, it became clear that Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement was morally bankrupt. On the 3rd of September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and Churchill was called back into government as the First Lord of the Admiralty.
Churchill, for his whole life, had an image of himself as a man of destiny and as a great military leader. It's no accident that at the start of the First World War, but more particularly throughout the Second World War after May 1940, he feels exhilarated because finally the image of Churchill in his head and Churchill in reality have come together.
At the start of the Second World War, Churchill was in a positive and energetic mood. But in the First World War, this positive mood had come to an end with the bloody failure of the Dardanelles campaign and Churchill's disgrace. Part of this pattern was about to repeat itself.
When Churchill was offered the post of First Lord of the Admiralty, the political head of the Admiralty, at the start of the Second World War, he was absolutely ecstatic. He bounded up the steps of the Admiralty, whooped for joy, entered the operations room, and began to move ships around.
But just as at the start of World War I, the early phases of the conflict didn't provide Churchill with much action. From September 1939 until May 1940, Hitler's expected invasion of Western Europe didn't come. In this dull period of phony war, Churchill became wedded to the idea of invading neutral Norway to block off the Nazis' access to Scandinavian iron ore. But historians now question the strategic value of the plan.
Churchill, once back in office, shows all the hallmarks of Churchill in office. A desire for immediate action, a desire to get things done without necessarily considering whether what was being done was the right thing.
Norway must be seen as a pet operation of Churchill's. His idea about the particular need at any one month for what one might do in Norway changed with the circumstances of the time. But essentially, I suppose, he always stuck to a somewhat similar conception. There would be an amphibious landing, and then, in fact, he wasn't quite sure.
Churchill's enthusiasm for the assault wasn't totally matched by a consistent strategic vision. As many as 3 times in a single night, Churchill revised his orders to the fleet. The Norwegian landings began on the 14th of April 1940, by which time the Nazis themselves had already occupied Norway. Without clear planning and air support, the attack was a disaster. Many soldiers died before the force was evacuated on the 2nd of May.
Does it achieve anything? No, it's a total and utter disaster. The only thing it does achieve for Churchill, ironically, is it provokes the vote of no confidence in Neville Chamberlain in the House of Commons that will bring Churchill to number 10.
On the 10th of May 1940, Churchill became Prime Minister. Churchill, who had long cherished a vision of himself leading Britain through crisis, now saw his vision come true. But the tide of war was just about to turn against him. The very same day as Churchill took up his new post, Hitler invaded France. Britain now stood alone against the Nazis. But there were 2 sides to Britain's wartime leader: a public image of strength that concealed inner weaknesses. In public, Churchill was the perfect defiant leader with his inspirational speeches.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
In September 1940, the German blitz of Britain's cities began, and Churchill used all his energy and charisma to boost the morale of the British people.
He journeyed among the sad relics of that evil power of the Luftwaffe, and he inspired us all with his determination, and he himself paid tribute to the determination he saw around him.
But behind the scenes, in the war room, Churchill's influence on the direction of military operations continued to show some of the hallmarks of the Norway campaign.
He's almost like a Catherine wheel. He sparks off ideas, but doesn't himself appear to know which is the good one, or indeed whether any of them are good. You have not only Norway before he becomes Prime Minister, you have Greece and Crete in 1941, you have Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in 1942, you have the attack on Sicily, Operation Husky in 1943. So I think Churchill's obsession, and I think it's not too strong a word, with military sideshows certainly could have led to a diversion of military effort.
Hundreds of thousands of Allied troops lost their lives in these campaigns. Churchill thrived on action, but experts now question whether this led to good strategic decisions.
Churchill's narcissistic character required crisis and challenge and risk-taking even. And part of the narcissist is having the confidence things will work out, sometimes lead to the bold actions which end up being seen as remarkable historical strokes, but sometimes leads to miscalculations.
By the end of 1941, the war cabinet was changing. The Americans entered the war in December 1941, and now stronger men tried to stand up to Churchill. The American General Marshall and the new British Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Alan Brooke.
It's clear from Alan Brooke's diaries that working with Churchill was for Alan Brooke the most extreme test of patience, of mettle, of human perseverance that one could imagine. Not waging war against the enemy, mark you, but waging war with Winston Churchill as Prime Minister. Alan Brooke at one stage says that most people consider Churchill to be a second Marlborough, but most people have no idea what it would be like to work with him constantly, day in, day out. And most people do not know what a menace, in fact, he was.
Even in June 1944, as the Allies launched the most vital attack of the war, Operation Overlord, the code name for the D-Day landings, Churchill was still captaining what some see as his pet project, a plan called Operation Armpit to launch an attack on Germany by climbing over the Italian Alps.
Churchill fancied this idea because it would have been led by one of his pet generals, Alexander. It would have comprised a majority of British troops, the chauvinistic streak in his strategy, and it would have been essentially a Churchillian notion. For all these reasons, it was deeply opposed by his own chiefs of staff, in particular Alan Brooke, who never saw the strategic sense of trying elephant-like to get over the Alps.
It is actually, I fear, another one of Churchill's barking mad ideas, and Alan Brooke and George Marshall will have nothing to do with it, and quite right too.
The Churchill that the public saw was a hero, but in the war room, the generals were forced to battle against Churchill's occasionally misguided view of military planning. But this wasn't their only cause of concern. At times, they were also alarmed by what they saw as Churchill's heavy drinking. In 1944, Allied troops were fighting their way across Europe, driving back the Nazis. For 4 long years, Churchill's inspirational courage gave Britain the will to fight on. But throughout that time, Churchill was a man with a tendency to depression and mood swings, a tendency that some argue he had learned to treat with liberal doses of alcohol.
Alcohol and mood are intimately related. I think when people are depressed, they often self-medicate with alcohol to relieve anxiety and maybe bolster their spirits a bit. I think when people are manic, they tend to be able to drink more. They drink more for enjoyment, they can tolerate it more, and often just go over the top on all manner of indiscretions, and drink is part of that.
As a teenager, Churchill developed a taste for champagne. But his drinking habits began to change in the 1930s.
People sometimes differentiate between bad drunks, mad drunks, and sad drunks. And he was kind of a sad, and I would see him almost using alcohol as an antidepressant. It is interesting in terms of his need for glory. It was when he was out of office that it was reported that he drank rather more heavily.
In the short term, you expect, as we all know, alcohol improves mood, it helps to overcome mood problems. Over a longer period, alcohol will itself be causing mood problems and will be ineffective as a self-medication, and has the risk attached to it of developing dependence on alcohol itself.
If Churchill started by using alcohol to ease depression, by the 1940s, he had become used to drinking on a daily basis, which could have had drastic repercussions on the war effort. On the 2nd of April 1940, Churchill tried to make a speech to the House of Commons, but he became confused and had to be led away, prompting the journalist Cecil King to comment, "It's at times like these that age and excessive brandy drinking tell."
There were indeed some occasions when at the late-night conferences to which the military were often subjected by Churchill, there's little doubt that Churchill had had too much to drink. There is a moment in 1944 when the diaries of all those present, Alan Brooke, Eden, and other military officers, all agree that Churchill was at times almost incoherent, and as one of them said, recuperating with drink.
But those close to Churchill are certain that he did not have a problem with alcohol.
He didn't drink very much. It was greatly exaggerated. For instance, after breakfast, he'd have a whiskey and soda.
It was very, very weak. It was about 1/3 the strength that most whiskey drinkers would accept, and he would have maybe 2 of these very weak whiskies and sodas before lunch.
The whiskey and soda was there to moisten his throat. The throat moistener, nothing else.
He would drink half a bottle of champagne, and after lunch he would drink 1 or 2 goblets of, but very small, about 1 inch, of brandy.
And then he would resume his weak whiskies and sodas in the afternoon, and in the evening more champagne, and then there would be whiskies and sodas through the night till he finally hit the hay at about 2:30, 3 in the morning.
And I never saw him the worse for drink.
Churchill's friends and colleagues are clear that he didn't drink to excess, but even moderate amounts of alcohol can present a problem in the longer term.
What does happen is that people develop tolerance to alcohol, and so may appear perfectly sensible, perfectly normal in their behaviours. They don't have the same warning signals that are telling them that they're drinking too much.
In 1944, Churchill was 70 and was drinking constantly throughout the working day. With this kind of pattern of consumption, he might have developed tolerance to alcohol, but over time, there can be other harmful effects.
It would be extremely unusual for somebody to be able to drink throughout the day, even small amounts, on a regular basis over a long period, and not have some harmful consequence of that.
For a man with Churchill's history, one of the most worrying of these long-term effects is the interaction between alcohol and depression.
Long-term alcohol abuse will probably make somebody's depression worse over time.
I think alcohol, although may give short-term relief to symptoms, often makes depressive symptoms worse.
As the crowds applauded him on VE Day, on the 8th of May 1945, Churchill must have been on a psychological high. But a downswing was to come sooner than Churchill could have predicted. Just 78 days later, a general election was held on the 25th of July 1945, and Churchill was voted out of office.
When the election results came along, I was in number 10 and I bumped into him. He said, "Mr. Kinner," he always called me Mr. Kinner, "come into the cabinet room and we'll have a chat." So he sat down and he was looking terribly miserable. And he started talking about the war and where we went. And then he had tears rolling down his cheeks. And he said, "And now the British people don't want me anymore." And I felt as though I wanted to cry too. It was so tragic. This great man, full of confidence, has now said, "I'm not wanted anymore."
After his heroic leadership, after having been elevated to the very stars, after having been seen as the very personalization of the British character that carried Great Britain through those darkest days of the Blitz, for him then to have been voted out of office must have been such a profound blow. I find it almost unimaginable, and surely must have been a shattering psychological experience for him.
Churchill had often experienced depression, but by 1945, some argue that a second long-term effect of alcohol was coming into play, stripping away the mental vigor he used to rely on to fight depression.
Effects of alcohol on the brain are well documented. It directly kills off parts of the brain. Once that damage has occurred, for some people, that's going to be irreparable.
The deleterious effects of alcohol on brain cells is well known. I think it's been said that with a martini you kill 100,000 brain cells, and I mean that may be over-dramatizing the case. But if you're doing this day in and day out, year in and year out, it can do nothing but augment the accelerated stages of aging of the brain.
And it was at this point, in the late 1940s, that a new and potentially life-threatening factor emerged. Churchill, like many people of his age, suffered from hypertension or high blood pressure, but this made him vulnerable to strokes.
When people have a stroke, the common cause is a blockage in the feeding artery going to the affected part of the brain. The bit of brain that is totally dependent on that artery will be irreparably damaged. Now, the things that cause that, age is the main factor. The arteries get a bit worn and harden as they age, but the main remediable cause of stroke is high blood pressure.
He had had hypertension for several years. He was he smoked cigars. He was a very avid drinker. He was reaching that age in which we began to see strokes in the 70s. He was an accident waiting to happen.
All these risk factors collided in August 1949, while Churchill was holidaying on the Riviera with his old friend Max Beaverbrook, the newspaper baron, who owned the Daily Express and the London Evening Standard.
In 1949, Churchill was playing cards at Beaverbrook's, and in the middle of the game said, "I've got a tightness in my shoulder, and my arm and my leg don't feel quite right." It was a sensation, an abnormal sensation. This was clearly a stroke related to his underlying hypertension. It affected his right side.
He thought his career was over, and everybody else did too. But Max ruled the press pretty well, or suggested to his fellow rulers, and it was kept very, very quiet indeed.
His friends kept the news out of the papers, and Churchill clung on to fight the 1951 general election. But Dr. Morum, Churchill's private physician, had doubts about how well Churchill had really recovered. He has lost ground, and no longer has the same grip on things and events. If he wins the election, I doubt whether he's up to the job.
If one were presented with someone like Winston Churchill these days and asked, well, what about a checkup before a re-election? And probably if a medical assessment had been done in an independent way, he would not have been allowed to go forward for election.
Without this kind of scrutiny, Churchill won the general election and on the 26th of October 1951 became Prime Minister for the second time.
But as we pay our solemn tribute to our Prime Minister, we congratulate ourselves that in our darkest hour, the British Empire found her greatest Prime Minister.
By 1951, the Cold War was already at its height, and the world already knew the power of the nuclear bomb. At this volatile time in history, Britain's Prime Minister was 76 years old, and what's more, he had a history of depression and strokes. But Churchill's image of himself was still as the strong man of destiny, and he felt that there was another battle that he had to fight.
Churchill has this obsession with trying to end the Cold War. There is this almost monomaniacal belief that he could bring peace. And so, even though he's been through the whole finest hour, he's had the whole man of destiny thing, he's still not satisfied. He wants to be a man of destiny yet again.
And Winston Churchill thought that he could achieve something if he met Stalin alone. And he thought that the problems could be ironed out, which was, I think, a thoroughgoing mistake in that way.
Churchill harked back to the great post-war summits. Then, he and the leaders of Russia and America met to decide on the peace settlement. But now, he failed to realize that the Cold War was different and couldn't be solved by personal meetings alone. With his mind firmly on the international scene, Churchill didn't always seem as interested in Britain's own vital post-war reconstruction. Nigel Nicholson, then a young Conservative MP, remembers meeting him in the House of Commons and trying to engage him on domestic issues.
Churchill was unresponsive, and he said to an older friend of ours later, "Who were those young men I was talking to in a smoking room? They're not members of our party, are they? They're just a set of pink pansies." Now, that was difficult, because in his second prime ministership, Churchill was only interested in the bomb.
Churchill, already distant from key political issues, now faced another setback when, on the 23rd of June 1953, he suffered a further devastating stroke.
The stroke he suffered in 1953, which was the second of his major strokes, took place at a dinner party he was giving for De Gasperi, the Italian leader, and was quite misinterpreted by all the guests there. It was thought that he'd drunk too much.
And he was helped up to bed, and by the next morning, when I went into work early, his voice was slurred. He went down to his beloved Chartwell to keep on with the work as normal. But it wasn't normal. Of course, it wasn't normal.
The Prime Minister was severely incapacitated. But once again, the British public were kept in the dark.
It was kept secret by the simplest of means. It was announced that he was unwell, he had a cold, and he'd retired from down to Chartwell.
His principal private secretary, a very dear friend, Jock Colville, wrote or got in touch with the two newspaper barons, Lord Camrose and Lord Beaverbrook.
The press were his friends, and they did react to a request.
I remember sitting in the office at Chartwell, and there were no press calls. It was extraordinary how that was managed.
News of the stroke was kept from the press, the public, and Parliament. After a period of rest, an even more severely weakened Churchill returned to number 10 Downing Street.
As regards his increasing frailty after the stroke, yes, it was apparent. The immediate circle round him were so protective that in a way I think our eyes were blinded to frailty. But I would hear outside Downing Street people saying that he was not achieving sufficiently to keep control of the government.
Two things, however, did remain strong. One was Churchill's own determination to stay in office, and the second was the devotion of those who knew and loved him.
Churchill himself didn't want to stop working. There's no doubt there's a fear of the depression, of the black dog descending on him.
Everybody was bending over backwards to say, you should be thinking about retirement, but if you don't like the thought of it, if it makes you very sad and unhappy, then let's carry on.
It wasn't just politically, it was also psychologically he could not retire. For the consummate narcissist, there's never enough. And a life out of the limelight is death.
In spite of his increasing frailty and the cumulative effects of strokes, Churchill couldn't contemplate retirement. He still needed to see himself as a key player on the political stage. His faculties were failing, so he turned to a drug called Benzedrine to help preserve an image of strength.
Benzedrine was the trade name for a chemical variant of amphetamine, methamphetamine, called on the street now speed. And what this does is it gives a feeling of euphoria, can convey a sense of vitality and brightness, which very much Churchill felt he needed because he was sensing his failing powers.
Churchill was known the world over as a powerful speechmaker, and the now elderly statesman wanted to preserve this skill. So as he prepared for the Conservative Party conference in Margate in October 1953, Churchill did what he had done many times before and asked his private physician, Dr. Moran, for help.
And he said, I would like 2 or 3 majors for this speech today, or I would like a Lord Moran for this speech today.
And so there would be the pill, the magic pill. And before Margate, he was given that.
He was a triumphant speech. He got through it in an amazing way. There was nothing wrong with him at all. And people said, what was all this talk of his having had a stroke?
He was on top of the world. And Lord Moran said to him, are you tired? And he said, no, I'm not at all tired. I'm well, he said. I can go on.
But this image of strength was just a drug-fueled illusion that could not be sustained. Eventually, on the 5th of April 1955, aged 80, Churchill gave in to the inevitable and stood down as Prime Minister.
The passing of Sir Winston Churchill from the Premiership will be profoundly felt, for inevitably our thoughts go back to the war years. Then he was our sword to strike tyranny. Our faith in him never wavered.
Once out of the limelight, Churchill found it increasingly hard to ward off his old enemy, depression. The picture of his final years is a dark one.
He looked at the end of his life as it having been a failure. Of course, if you reminded him of the Battle of Britain, you might say, or any other part of the World War, because undoubtedly, if any single man can be said to have won the war, it was he. He said, oh well, those things are past. It was very melancholy.
But if Churchill felt that his life had achieved nothing, to the British people, he was a hero, the man who saved the world from Hitler. When Churchill died in January 1965, the whole nation mourned.
I followed my grandfather's coffin at my father's side. There were old soldiers standing to attention, children waving Union Jacks. Incredibly emotional occasion, wonderful occasion.
The truth about Churchill is that he is a national hero, not in spite of his problems, but because of them. Churchill's unusual psychology made him willing to do things that other men would never have attempted, like standing up to Hitler in 1940.
To become a great leader, you need to have a highly unusual personality. You need to have quite an unusual mood, a great self-confidence, a great belief in yourself to achieve things which maybe, I think, ordinary, more balanced individuals probably wouldn't even wish to attempt.
If you go back to 1940 and the fall of France, I think that the entire British nation was suffering from post-traumatic stress. No one but a fool could have believed in the summer of 1940 that Britain would not surrender. Well, Churchill was a fool, but a holy fool. This is where Churchill's absolute obsession with himself at the center of the universe and his own conception of British history suddenly were right.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender.
In 1940, at Britain's darkest hour, Churchill's vision of himself as a man of destiny came true. Without this flawed but heroic man's defiance in the face of Hitler and the strength of his self-belief, Britain could never have fought on to victory.
In a moment, to look at next week's Altered Statesman, Boris Yeltsin.